I'm Soumya Makbool, and I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School. And on behalf of the SECON team, we welcome you all over here. So, as you may all be aware, in its 17th year, SECON's content has been focused on the untold truths of social enterprise and challenge participants to dare to take the steps necessary to make a difference. In keeping with the theme of this conference, Starting Up My Story features startups, projects, and entrepreneurs from diverse fields and geographies. The panelists will talk about their sources of inspiration, the challenges they face in setting up, and what lies ahead for them. And we have with us Nat Ware, who's going to be moderating this session. He's the founder and CEO of 180 Degrees Consulting, the world's largest social impact consultancy with branches in 30 countries and over 5,000 consultants worldwide. I'll hand over to Nat to take it from here.
Fantastic. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for choosing this session over many other fantastic sessions as well. Hope you find it valuable, and hopefully we'll have a great hour together as we sort of hear from and learn from some of these different startups. The way that we're going to structure this session is we'll sort of go through, and I'll give everyone a few minutes just to introduce their venture so that you can sort of know what they've been working on, so that you have a bit of context to the discussion that will then proceed. But I want to spend most of the time having more of sort of a thematic discussion and focusing less on the specifics of these ventures, but more on things that are actually transferable and useful and key insights that the panel might be able to pass on to you for the work that you are currently doing and may do in the future. Before we go through the presentations, I might actually put everyone on the spot. And if you were describing your venture in sort of a tweet, 140 characters, what's sort of that one sentence description of your venture? And then I'll give you 3 or 5 minutes to go into more detail, but just so that everyone has a bit of context for the variety of ventures that we have with us today. So, Michelle.
Tweets.
One sentence or tweet length.
So, Karachi United leverages the power of football to empower Pakistan.
Open Biome is a non-profit stool bank, or the Red Cross for poop. Alright, so Sensei is a wheelchair system that helps disabled wheelchair users navigate.
So we provide opportunities for women in Africa to create opportunities for themselves and their families by pushing their startups.
Hi, DocuTribe is a skills-building enterprise for marginalized youth to help them teach themselves to become part of the community.
Fantastic. So that's very briefly in 5 tweets the range of ventures that we have. I know that from 140 characters it's not always easy to get a feel for those ventures. So what we'll do over the next 20 minutes or so is just, I'll give everyone a chance to go into a bit more depth, but then we'll proceed to more of a discussion. So, Michelle, do you want to go first?
I don't think I have a choice.
Feel free to. Does someone who doesn't have PowerPoint want to go while we sort of get started? Oh, there we go. Go for it.
Okay, so I'll be quite quick. This is Karachi United. And we're kind of new in terms of a startup venture. And just to tell you a little bit about my story, I am a kinesiologist by training, so I wasn't always playing football. I started very late in my life. And just to show of hands, how many of you here grew up playing sports? Did you have that opportunity? Okay, it's not so bad. And so when I grew up, that wasn't always available. I grew up in Pakistan. Even though I went to private school, it wasn't encouraged. And so when I moved back to Pakistan in 2010, I was really involved in playing football. It's football to me, soccer to some people, but I'm going to keep saying football. So when I moved back, there was no setup, there was nowhere to go to play, there was just really no industry. And I just really wanted to play. And I wasn't thinking about social enterprise, I wasn't thinking about entrepreneurship, it was just, I wanted to play. And in trying to get that to happen, I realized that I'm gonna have to create the industry if I want to keep doing this. And so we had to think of ways to try and do that. And it kind of, the only way to do that was to create a pipeline of children, of young parents, of females who we could recruit to play. And in that process, what we learned was so much. We learned why girls don't play, why children don't play, why playing is not a thing, why sports is considered a luxury, if not a waste of time. And in that process, it took about 4 or 5 years to do this. We realized that there's a huge social impact factor that we're missing out on here. I mean, sport is a great thing, to engage in, but it's also a vehicle for change. And through sport, we can acknowledge a lot of the other issues that a lot of these girls talk to us about. Some of them get married at 15 years old, and at the time, it's weird, but we don't acknowledge it as a problem. Some of them come from, you can see these girls, their heads are all covered. This area that they come from is entirely occupied by the Taliban. So there's a lot of these issues that we address just by playing sport, because in doing that, we build relationships, they create little relationships between themselves, and we start talking about these problems. And that's pretty much when we realized that in order to do this, a good way to do it would be to become some kind of nonprofit or some kind of foundation as opposed to private entity. And that's when we made the switch. We only did it last year. And we're still alive. And so essentially the point is to create a pipeline. And that is essentially what became our social enterprise cause, to create a channel of future leaders, not just the women. I'm just giving you my story, but we're a co-ed program, and the ratio of women to men is about one girl to about 40 boys. That's the ratio. And so the point is that in starting up, we realized that it's not just about us moving where we want to go, it's about the pull factor. And so that's pretty much what we do, and we play for a bigger cause. So that's scratching it.
Okay, I'll be relatively brief, no slides from Open Biome. So, and really not much more to say, I think I covered it in a tweet. So Open Biome is a nonprofit organization. We run a stool bank. And so you might ask, why are we doing this? There's a medical procedure called a fecal transplant, which some of you may have heard of. Essentially, we use this procedure today to treat a disease called Clostridium difficile. It's the most common hospital-acquired infection in the country. It affects about 500,000 people every year in the U.S., about 30,000 deaths every year. And so this disease often is not responsive to antibiotics, which are the standard of care treatment, but we can take an alternate intervention, which is a fecal transplant, where we're actually taking stool from a healthy donor, implanting it into the patient, and what we're really after there is not the poop itself, but the microbes inside of that poop. Many of you may have heard that there are 10 bacterial cells in your body for every 1 human cell. So this community of bacteria, primarily living in your gut, is a critical sort of organ for your body in terms of regulating how many of your systems work, your metabolic system, your immune system, and in particular controlling this particular infection called Clostridium difficile. So that's great. This treatment works about 90% of the time in terms of absolute cure of patients, which sort of far exceeds the sort of standard antibiotic course of therapy. In 2012, this was well known and sort of very excitingly published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the top tier medical journal, but patients couldn't get access to this treatment. In fact, I had a friend who had a C. difficile infection, and he went through a 1.5 years of being on very heavy antibiotics, not being comfortable getting on public transportation because he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to make it to a bathroom. This disease gives you very severe diarrhea. And ultimately considered, quitting the job and sort of, retreating essentially due to this disease. this guy tried to get a fecal transplant from his doctor and it wasn't available. Hospitals weren't doing this procedure. They didn't want to deal with finding donors, they didn't want to deal with screening the material, they definitely didn't want to deal with processing poop in a hospital. It's not exciting and not a cool thing for hospitals to be doing. So we launched Open Biome really to create the sort of public healthcare infrastructure around the fecal transplant process and sort of identified a pool of healthy donors. We do all the processing in our laboratory, and then we ship treatments around the country. Today we're working with a little over 550 hospitals across the US and in 6 countries, and we've sent out well over 10,000 treatments at this point. So pretty large scale. Our mission ultimately is to enable safe access to fecal transplantation for any patient in need of this treatment, which again, as I mentioned, C. diff is the most common hospital-acquired infection in this country. So it's a very large kind of public health problem and something that we're really focused on kind of resolving. I think I'll cut it off there because I want to keep the ball rolling, but we do also have a very large focus in research in the microbiome, and so there's kind of a whole world of new treatments and sort of new disease areas that we're focused on, but again, I'll keep it at that point and we can get back to that later.
Thank you. Hi guys and good morning, I'm Stephen Campbell. All right, good morning, I'm Stephen Campbell and I'm the founder of Sensei. It's a wheelchair obstacle avoidance system. So 3.3 million Americans use wheelchairs, and in late 2010 my grandmother was one of them. I was pushing her down a hallway in her constricted and tight assisted living home and noticed how difficult it was avoiding people, walls, potted plants, and I ended up kind of hurting her, pushing her along. And I thought, there has to be a solution to this, right? Am I the only one who has the problem of pushing around a wheelchair? Turns out I was, but we'll get to that later. So here's our first prototype. It basically uses a speaker and a distance sensor to judge the distance of close objects to the wheelchair and alerts the user accordingly, beeping faster the closer a wall is. So to further advance my prototype, I was accepted into the University of Pennsylvania's Warden Catapult Business Incubator, and I was joined by 4 other awesome teammates, and we got a lot of great press. We were featured on numerous industry-specific and entrepreneurship-focused blogs. But we really noticed one thing through our trials and through hundreds of patient interviews, that there really was no need for our product. So we pivoted and we really listened to the stuff we heard in between our questions, which was how wheelchair users have a huge issue navigating behind them. So we pivoted and we looked at some data and we found that over 80% of wheelchair users are indoors, but furthermore, around 80% of power wheelchair users have either a neurological or a spinal cord injury that prevents them from looking behind them very well. So our second prototype addressed that. It has 3 ultrasonic sensors that are pointed behind the wheelchair to the left, straight back, and right of the wheelchair that alert them on a display showing where the closest wall is. So here we can see it mounted onto a wheelchair. We have our left and right ultrasonic sensors, our display, and here I'll show just a quick demonstration of it. Here's a patient navigating through a constrictive corridor. We can see as the left wall approaches quickly, the left side of the display will light up, and accordingly with the right side. So left side lighting up, right side. And you can see he's relying.
Get both lights coming on.
You can see he's relying heavily on the device to navigate through. So what lies ahead for Sensei? One of the things we're focusing on right now is intellectual property. We want to protect the device. In addition, we're pursuing hospital trials. I presented in front of the CEO of one of the largest hospital chains around my house, and we have testing rights at the hospitals. In addition, we're pursuing partnerships with the American Physical Therapy Association, American Spinal Cord Injury Association. We're trying to get our device in the hands of physical therapists as they teach new powered wheelchair users how to navigate. In addition, we're looking at other applications such as motorized scooters and segways. Thank you.
I don't have a presentation, so I think I can stand here. Thank you all for coming. My name is Kosi Yankee, and I'm from Ghana. Thank you for coming as well. What I'm doing is Africa's missing middle, and it's a very interesting concept, and people ask me what's missing about the middle of Africa. And is it only focused on women or men? But what the story is and how I got to this idea and why I started was because I looked at Africa. I'm from Ghana, and our GDP was going down constantly. And there was very high unemployment, not only in Ghana, but in most of the countries around us. And if you look at Africa, there are 200 million youth, and it's growing. It's going to have one of the largest youth population in the world, and up to 80% of them are unemployed. And then you have women who make up 60% of small and medium enterprise businesses in a country like Ghana, but then they get less than 2% of the loans that are giving out. Then I realized there were a lot of people focusing on the microfinance businesses. So I had a microfinance business, which I started in 2007, and I worked with thousands of women in Ghana, lending money to them. Then there was the bigger banks and the private equity shops, and then there were other financial institutions who came in and targeted the bigger businesses that were looking for 1 million plus. And there was a huge missing gap. They did not have access to funding, from 10,000 all the way to 200,000. Most of the businesses that would come in would say, yes, we're going to fund you, but a few years in, realized that there was so much influx of capital that they made sense for them to go into 5 million and expend the money there. So I took it upon myself and started paying close attention. And I did this because my grandmother was actually a market trader, and she sold in the markets of Ghana. She was known as the Mama Benzes of their time, where they would sell cloth and make money, and their goal was to buy Benzes. Not only Benzes, it was just the hypothetical Benz. But then they took care of the whole communities and villages that they came from. So when I moved back to Ghana from the United States in 2007, I went back with some friends, one of whom is here, Asidua, and most of us started businesses and realized that access to funding to grow our businesses was a big problem. We were not the only ones, but for a lot of other people coming into the market. So our goal then was, how do we actually start a fund and actually support these women, not only with funding, but also an ecosystem that provides support to the businesses of these women so they can grow and employ people, because that was the engine of the economy. For us to be able to move our GDP and to be able to increase employment, the focus was to support these women in their businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Cecily Tyler, and I am the founder of Docu Tribe Inc. And before we start the video, I'm just going to tell a quick story. So when I was about 15 years old, I was living with my father, and I had a little rebellious streak, and I lied to him, and we had an agreement that we would never lie to one another. And so in order to reprimand me, instead of grounding me, which was a typical tradition in my community, he sent me down to Massachusetts General Hospital to be a supporter to people who were in the hospital in a long-term stay. And in doing that, I ended up being a recreational therapist, which is sort of a trained candy striper, in the burn unit and in the amputee division. And I met a young woman who was my age, who had come from a marginalized community, and she was a victim of a burn that covered her entire body, and I couldn't tell you what her skin color was because she was purple and covered in bandages. And this experience haunted me in this beautiful way that made me realize we need to take care of our most vulnerable. And so through my opportunities of going to a great college and having great luck in my career, which is highly competitive, I've always tried to ensure that I'm sandwiched in the middle, where I'm getting support, but I'm passing on support. And I feel that that is my responsibility, and it's an obligation that I honor. And I think anyone in this room today understands where I'm coming from. I know like these really inspirational people do. And so I have sought over the past few years to mentor young people. And so Cody is a young man that I came across. But before we watch this video, just keep in mind there were 2 cameramen that were young that needed to make this video. There was a sound guy. There was me who needed to organize the story. There was a musician who gave us his music, who also came out of juvenile delinquency. He now works for Marty Walsh and serves the juvenile delinquency division here, and he's still a musician. So there's a whole team of people that brought this story to life. And there's all the people that you see in front of the camera that are sustaining the story, staying alive. So this is a cut down version of a longer video, so it's not the perfect edit, but bear with me here.
My name is Cody Flynn. I grew up in Dorchester. I've lived there all my life. I love it. I've always known the Leahy Hallmark Community Center was always here, and I was a terror here. And actually some of the staff that worked back then still remember me. I asked them the other day, and they were like, oh yeah, we remember you, Cody. I was like, all right. And I come back, and I'm like, oh, I'm all grown up and way bigger. You know what I mean? When I was younger, I didn't make the best decisions. Like, I would do like really dumb things for like no reason, just do reckless things. Honestly, I'm pretty thankful that like I'm still alive. I was a very angry kid when growing up, extremely. Like, had a chip on my shoulder. Like, I was very angry. My dad wasn't around at all. Like, he never was around. And I mostly like grew up with my mom. My mom took the best care of me when I was younger. She was a good mom. My mom passed away in 2012 of a drug overdose. It was tough. I was very close with my mom. You know, I did a lot of things with my mom. I had fun with my mom, shared a lot of memories with my mom. You just gotta be grateful. Like, I was still like doing bad when she passed away. And I was like, damn, I need to do good. And I just turned around for her. Got a job here. It was really this job. I love this job. Like, I love coming here when like kids are laughing and having fun. I just want to show them like the right way and like the way things are supposed to be. I want drugs off the streets, and I want to just like the streets to be safer. And like I want this place to be like gold staircases. You have a smile on your face. It's the way to go.
So that was Dan's first time directing. I really just acted as sort of a coordinator, which is what I hope to do with the social enterprise. So what DocuTribe is seeking to do is to give what we gave Cody that day, which is the art of play, the art of storytelling, the skills of filmmaking to the entire community that made this video, and the skills of social new media, where we put it out there. And in between the time that we filmed this to the time that we delivered it back to Cody, he had fallen off track again. And we brought him back in to see the video, and he remembered that this was part of his voice too. So yes, he comes from a history where there's violence, where there's drugs, where there's challenges, but he also is this, and he needed a gentle reminder. And so through the act of filmmaking, we're creating a stamp in these youth's lives to say, you get to be the change that you aspire to be in your community. So whether you want to create a social panel, you know, a solar panel installation company, do you want to go out and tutor your younger kids? Do you want to go out and become a basketball coach? What is the change that you want to see happen for your community? How can we support you? And so DocuTribe is going to be developing strong partnerships for these youth to go out, create an idea for themselves, and then to bring it to fruition through these support mechanisms, and then to remember that they did that by documenting it in a film, and then also giving them tools to tell the world about what they're doing in social media, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter feeds, the rest of it. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So that's sort of an overview of all the different startups, all the different ventures, just so you have sort of a bit of an understanding for the discussion we're about to have. I think one of the most useful things when I've been talking to other entrepreneurs over the past sort of 10 years that I've been in this space is to learn from their mistakes and to learn what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and so on. And so what I'd like to do now is to get everyone to talk to their former selves. So if they could have a 1 minute telephone conversation with themselves at the time at which they were starting out their journey, what would they say? And I think it's interesting because, you know, we've all made mistakes, and hopefully from hearing sort of about some of the things and some of the advice that we give ourselves, hopefully you'll sort of learn a bit and not make the same mistakes again. So we might just go down the line. I'm not going to sort of ask everyone to respond to every question, but I think in this case we'll get everyone to talk to themselves. So just 1 minute, very quickly, what advice would you give your former self?
I would tell myself that, I would say you will fail, but it doesn't mean that you are a failure. It just means you have to re-strategize. And I think that I would still say this to myself today, every day.
I think if I were talking to myself at the beginning, I would suggest strongly to look hard for other people to bring into your organization quickly. Bring in additional leadership. You know, you can't do it all yourself. If it's going to succeed and it's going to grow quickly and it's going to be a success, then you're going to want to have other people working hard with you. And so, you know, whenever you can find good, smart leadership to bring into your organization, jump on it and do that before it's too late, before you needed it.
All right, so I would tell myself to spend more time on determining the need for my product. One of our biggest mistakes was focusing on manual wheelchairs instead of the real issue, which was power wheelchairs. So I would tell myself, you know, instead of creating a problem, try to solve one, and really focus on the interviews, right? When we reach out to our customers, potential clients, we really be critical of what they say because they want to help you. You know, we're enthusiastic entrepreneurs, and I think that's really key.
I think for me, what I would say is spend more time with the people. Like, you need to understand the people to better understand the needs that they have.
I would say make sure that you establish really strong partnerships. Don't be a lone wolf. And I would also say give yourself the opportunity to grow flexibly because that's a huge piece of aligning yourself with the needs.
Thank you. I might add one comment on this. I didn't sort of give a presentation or anything. 180 Degrees Consulting, just by way of background, we're the largest consultancy for nonprofits and social enterprises. Started about 8 years ago in Australia and sort of grown it. We're now in 30 countries and work with everyone from Red Cross through to small startups. But I think one of the things that I tell myself is don't try to change the world in one go. Don't try to do too much. And I think one of the key mistakes that entrepreneurs make time and time again is trying to do everything at the beginning. And I think the ventures that succeed are those that narrow down and do one thing really well. Google did search really well, now that they can do other things. Amazon did books really well, now they can branch out. And so a lot of the bigger ventures start narrow, dominate that market, be the best at that narrow thing, and then that gives you the scale to then be able to expand. That was something that I didn't know at the time, but it's something that I've learned along the way. Next question. I think one of the key things for people starting up is the issue of risk. And I'm talking both about financial risk, which is obviously a key concern, but also about other risks. Because they say in entrepreneurship, the highs are higher, the lows are lower, and it's also pretty emotionally difficult, this sort of roller coaster ride. And so I just wanted to ask people on the panel, you don't all need to respond, but if you want to sort of give your thoughts on this issue of risk, how you deal with it, how you manage it, how you overcome it, how you sort of conceptualize risk, because I think that is something that is common to all entrepreneurs, and it's something that differentiates entrepreneurship from many of the other career options that we have available. So who wants to give a thought on that? James.
So I think one thing about social entrepreneurship versus more traditional entrepreneurship that is kind of an awesome feature that kind of lets you manage risk a little bit better. So what I'm talking about is if you can rack up some early wins from a social perspective with your organization, for me personally, that's something that you can sort of always look back on and say, hey, if all this goes down the tubes, I've accomplished something. So at Open Biome, we've helped enable, over 10,000 treatments, and so we face existential threats every day, and something's always coming down the line that could totally sink the organization. But it's really nice to be able to say, yeah, even if this whole thing goes belly up, we know we've already helped a lot of people. And so, again, this is something I think that, in particular, as a social entrepreneur, if you can find those moments and those impacts that you've been able to have in the short term and remember them and document them and look back on them, for me, it always helps to manage those big picture risks, because at the end of the day, we've already accomplished something great.
I think for me, because I'm working with youth in particular, I'm very cognizant of creating more harm. So if I believe the risk of coming in and supporting a youth halfway is much more harmful, because what you've done is you've taken away the hope. And that is what my best intention, right, that I bring, is to give them. And when I show them that they only get to do that halfway, I've created so much more harm, because I've created an expectation. So that's the biggest risk that I navigate with this. I think also in terms of a personal risk as an entrepreneur, yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna buy an Audi this year, right? So it's that kind of thing that I also wanna be prepared for, is that, this is a gamble. Mitigating risk is something that we can all learn to do better and better each day, but there's always going to be a gamble. And so I think when I give my time to this project, I have to have the mindset of saying, like, this is a gift to this project, and it really doesn't matter whether there's a payoff or not, because this is a more challenging space to work within, the social enterprise, than going in and knowing that you're going to climb a ladder because you did a good job and then you get the payoff. That doesn't always happen in this field, so hopefully that's helpful.
I think it was, feel free to.
One thing I just want to add to what's been said already is that for me it was more about reframing risk. So I mean, to me it's more of a process than an outcome. And so if I reframe what might be a risk into a learning process, it's easier to handle and tackle. And speaking to what was said earlier about counting small wins and letting them settle into what you're trying to do, especially in terms of social enterprise. This is important because it builds not just your own credibility in what you're doing, but also to the people who might invest in your project.
I think one thing I'd add to that, and I do think it was interesting what was said about social risk, that is the risk of not having the social impact or even creating harm, and I think that is a concern that social entrepreneurs have that other entrepreneurs don't. I think one sort of thing that I've learned over the years is that we often place a lot of weight on financial risk when we're making decisions. And obviously there's financial risk associated with starting up a new venture. The way that I try to overcome that is by also viewing regret as a risk. That is, there is a risk that you'll regret something if you don't start. And so once you sort of change the equation from, on one hand, if you start up a venture, there's a huge amount of risk, and if you go into Goldman Sachs, there's no risk. That's what a lot of people think, right? That a safe salary versus risky startup. But if you add into that equation a different type of risk, that is the risk of regret, then I find that it sort of balances out. Then it's, well, if I go into Goldman Sachs, there's a higher risk that I'll regret not doing the startup for the rest of my life, or regret not doing that. So it's, on one hand, risk of regret, on the other hand, financial risk. And by sort of conceptualizing regret as a risk alongside financial risk, I find that they sort of even out, or they balance out. Or at least in my mind, I don't feel like it's a choice between doing something safe and doing something risky. I view that there's always risk, it's just a question of the type of risk. And at least for me, I don't want to live a life of regret. I'd prefer to take the financial risk. And so that's sort of how I try to sort of embrace risk rather than sort of shy away from it. One sort of, moving on to the sort of next thing, I think two pieces of advice that entrepreneurs starting up often get time and time again, and they seem to really conflict. One piece of advice you always get is, there will be haters and detractors, and you just need to persevere and prove them wrong. You'll eventually succeed. Just put your head down, work hard, prove them wrong. Have faith in yourself, believe in yourself. Who's got that piece of advice before? I think it's pretty common. Another piece of advice you get is, you know, the reality is that 95% of startups fail, or whatever the statistic is, and you're told that, you know, you need to be objective, you need to be data-driven, you need to sort of approach things in a rational, logical way, and rationally and logically, you know, most startups fail. And don't just rely on family and friends who are going to give you biased advice. You need to be objective and talk to other people. And so that's another piece of advice that we commonly get as entrepreneurs, and the two seemingly conflict. The way that I hold those two pieces of advice together, and I think this is a useful attitude to have, I think you need sort of faith and belief that you're vaguely in the right direction, that you're broadly heading in the right direction with your venture, with the need, and so on. And so you have faith that you'll eventually get there. It's almost a maze. You know that there's a solution, you know that there's a path. But also I think it's important to have humility and to think that you don't have things figured out. That you might know there's a solution to the maze, but you don't exactly know the full route. You know vaguely you're going in the right direction, but you don't know exactly all the paths you're going to take. And I think that attitude of faith that you're going to get there, faith that you're broadly heading in the right direction, but also the humility that you don't have it all figured out, that you still need to learn, you might need to pivot here and there. I think that's how you hold those two things together. And even, Stephen, you were talking about, you know, you were broadly in the right direction in terms of helping people in wheelchairs who are facing big problems, but you were objective enough to be like, okay, our first idea maybe was wrong, let's take a step back and go here. And eventually you'll figure it out, and it seems like you did. And so that was just sort of a thought. One other issue, I think, with a lot of startups is thinking of, if your venture is going to fail, why is it going to fail? And I think having that sort of foresight helps when everyone's starting up a venture. And so we might just sort of go down the line, feel free to skip, or not everyone has to answer, but I want to ask, if your venture is going to fail in the next 5 years, if it's not going to be around, why will that be? Or what is the most likely reason why your venture won't be around? And it could be that you've solved the social problem and there's no need in an ideal world, but we'll go down the line.
It's a great question. For me, given where we work, the biggest threat to our existence is the social and political climate of where we work. And so if a government that comes into power that isn't governing, comes over and says, we don't want kids to be doing this, we'd rather have them do X, Y, Z. I don't know I'm not sure how we'd respond to that.
So at Open Biome, there's no question that regulatory risk is sort of the overarching kind of existential threat. If we were, closed down in 5 years, it would be due to probably an FDA action. And what's interesting about that risk is that it's not a risk that we see every day, and there's a real, it's very tempting to sort of, focus on working with more hospitals, expanding our treatment options, maybe doing a bunch of press about Open Biome and going about the day-to-day sort of growth, exciting, fun stuff, and forget about the fact that our main sort of, the main body that we really need to be working with and communicating with is FDA. So we take very seriously our mission to work with FDA, inform them about what we're seeing on the ground and what's going on in this very novel field of healthcare. It would, again, we could very easily sort of forget about them, and then 2 years from now we would find ourselves facing potential serious action that would close us down. So it's this kind of issue of always needing to step back and think about what those existential threats are, and really focus a lot of your energy on preparing for them and working around them, even when they're not the sort of day-to-day challenge of actually running a business. They're sort of two very different challenges, both of which need kind of a lot of full attention.
So I think the biggest risk to Sensei is our wheelchair design our device design not gaining traction. We really need to secure partnerships with the American Physical Therapy Association to give us credibility in the space. Otherwise, we're just this kind of third party hanging out on the sidelines in the hospitals telling people to take us seriously. But if we have the stamp of approval from one of the largest organizations for therapists and wheelchair users, that would really help us gain traction.
So why will the venture fail? I mean, Africa is one of the most difficult places to do business. And my dad once said, if you want to go to business school, start a business in Africa. And then, and then you will learn from it. You know, and one of the things that looking at some of the women that we've given money to, most of them are in food processing. And you know the big energy crisis in Africa. And so most of them have had to make up, found solutions, different solutions. But I think going forward, if we don't find solutions to the energy problems, a huge chunk of what we're doing will erode. And then the other factor is also the foreign exchange, because you then have a lot of funds flowing into Africa or into our countries, which are dollar denominated, and the currencies with all the crisis, financial crisis around the world would actually have an impact on that. So that's what I worry about when I wake up.
I think for me, right now, one of the most successful organizations, Youth Build USA, who we are partnered with, working with marginalized youth, have a pretty standard 40% outcome of success amongst our severely marginalized youth, which there's about 6.7 million in the United States alone, and Youth Build's serving 10,000 right now. So that's one challenge, is to have reports back that are not what funders necessarily want to hear all the time. And that's a challenge when you don't have a revenue generating model, except one that might be able to mirror something like TED and TEDx or Khan Academy in terms of scaling up with any kind of revenue. So this would be a fully subsidized program, eventually, hopefully, government adopted. But I think after year 3, which is when funders in the philanthropy division usually stop giving, there's going to be a challenge. Am I looking at CR, corporate responsibility funding in the for-profit sector? Or, you know, am I positioned to chase government dollars that are really sustainable long-term? So I think that that's a big piece of the puzzle that I feel very challenged by when looking at this.
Sure.
I just wanted to add something. You know, thinking about your existential problems, one of the ways to address this is to start building relationships from the very get-go. So I mentioned the cultural and political system that threatens our organization. We currently have always tried to work with them to try and mitigate this risk. So it's not just about helping our own constituency, it's about building partnerships across different platforms that enable your own longevity, inevitably, and also within the organization, thinking about succession planning and building leadership so that in the event that you're not doing what you started out to do, at least it's not a threat to the existence of your organization.
That leads nicely into the next question. We've talked a bit about sort of mistakes and whatnot. I just want to ask, what is the single best decision that you made in your organization? What is something that sort of improved it, transformed it, that meant that it still exists today? Again, we don't need everyone to answer, but feel free to sort of, who wants to give a response?
So rather than kind of a single decision, it's sort of a series of decisions, or more of a philosophy of how to make certain types of decisions, I think, that has led to a lot of good outcomes at OpenBiome. Namely, you know, move quickly, I think, and what that means is, you know, there are many cases in which we've said, oh, you know, should we wait longer to talk to more people and learn more about, you know, what's going on in this field? Should we try to, you know, get someone to champion us before we kind of go public with our latest product or our kind of next announcement? And the move to always just say, let's just go for it, let's get this out there and kind of get the ball rolling early has always been a good move. I think it's, you know, from our very first kind of public announcement of, you know, this is a service we'd be offering to the medical field, you know, not waiting until we had everything perfectly worked out, but saying we need to get this out there. Has been a really valuable sort of philosophy of making decisions for us.
I think what's been important for me are the advisors and putting in place the right advisors to support me through this process, because I couldn't have done it alone in terms of setup, in terms of, even finding funding to do some of the projects that we had done. And so finding the right advisors who came through and who actually pushed us and stopped us if we were going the right direction or gave alternatives to some of the solutions that we had.
I just need to reiterate, like partnerships, and don't worry too much about the competitiveness. I think that an older model in this sector has taught you, like keep yourself tight, keep yourself protected from someone taking your idea and then getting your funding. I think the reality is that the funding will come if you're uniquely positioned and if you have a good idea, and people usually fund the person, not the entity and the idea, more so. So always just keep on your game, and if you are altruistic at heart, chase it. Don't worry about protecting yourself from your quote-unquote competition. Right now, my biggest competitor is one of my advisors. So, and that's really an important piece, and we are working together, and we have great dynamic conversations, and we're just different enough, right? But I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle, is that we're all trying to do something that's bettering what we perceive as not going well, and so partnerships is a really key piece.
I'm just going to reiterate, partnerships, very important, very, very.
We have a bit of a trend in the answers there. What I might do now, if we have time at the end, I'll ask some more questions to the panel, but I did want to give you a chance to ask your own questions, so I want to make it a bit more interactive. I might accept a few questions before we go to the panel. If your question is general, that's totally fine. If your question is directed at a particular person, maybe say that as well. Do we need the mics, or we're fine without? Sure.
Hi, you stand up.
No, either's fine.
My question, I guess, is more towards you, Nat. What are certain industries or areas that you would advise potential social entrepreneurs to avoid?
Sorry, areas or?
Areas or industries or certain fields.
Sure. I might take 2 or 3 questions before we.
Thank you. My question is for Mrs. Corsi.
Yes.
So, how do you select your participants in the program? And what are the groups of the women you're targeting? Are they in Accra or in other more rural areas? How do you do that?
My question is for the panel. How many of you had partners when you started? And if you started when you didn't have partners, how did you go about finding a partner?
Okay, thank you. I might just answer this first question in terms of what sectors or industries to avoid. I think one thing about social entrepreneurship is, we do have a big focus on the founder and the entrepreneur, and maybe too much of a focus, I think, in general. And it is worth being aware of all the different options available. Obviously, you can start your own venture, and then there's a lot of different ways of segmenting ventures. You can segment it by industry, healthcare, environment, etc., or you can segment it by business model and the type of thing you're doing. It's also worth being aware of all the other options out there as well. Whether sometimes it's better to take an existing social enterprise that's maybe been around for a few years but hasn't scaled yet, and you can be the one to take it from being a small social enterprise with a lot of potential and really making it something. And that sort of thing doesn't get as much attention, but is often a good approach. Obviously, the scope for sort of entrepreneurs, people being entrepreneurial within organizations, and there is an argument that, say you started a venture at google.org or something, there's an argument that then you don't need to deal with sort of recruiting talent and funding because it's already there, and maybe you can have a bigger scale and a bigger impact more quickly. You might not get as much credit because, for better or worse, we tend to sort of hero worship founders, but it's worth being aware of the full spectrum in which you can have an impact. I think one piece of advice I'd give is to look at where you can add unique value. That I think when people are choosing careers, we often look at impact that a job has. So you might compare sort of the impact that your work BCG or McKinsey or Bain or Google has with an alternative impact. But I think the right question is to look at what would happen if you weren't there. So if you didn't work for McKinsey, probably they'd hire someone else who's basically just as good as you, and basically just as qualified as you, and basically going to have the same impact as you. And so you being at McKinsey, even if you're working on, say, a social impact project, doesn't actually have a marginal increase in social impact, apart from the extent to which you think you're better than whoever would be in your place otherwise. And so I think viewing it as what is your unique contribution and asking yourself what would happen if you weren't there is a good way to think about the impact that you can have in your careers. I'm not going to sort of say what industries to avoid, because I do think it's very personal, and I do think that people, you want to do something that you're really passionate about, and you want to do something that even if you fail, you'll be glad that you did it. And that differs person to person. There are obviously some industries where it's much easier to align social and financial returns than others. I think in the energy and environment space, that's one where it's quite easy to align social and financial returns. I mean, Tesla, I view Tesla as a social enterprise. Elon Musk wouldn't call it himself a social entrepreneur. I view him as a social entrepreneur. He's worth, what, 10, 15 billion. So some industries are easier to align social and financial returns than others. If you're trying to make money off what Amnesty International does, it's going to be a bit more difficult. So I think it's worth thinking both about sort of the industry and social cause as well as the business model. We might go on to some of the other questions. So how do you select participants?
So before I started, I developed a program for the Canadian government and Lundin Foundation, which is an impact investor. And the concept of the program was a mobile business clinic, where we'll travel from region to region in West African countries and try to develop programs and to get business entrepreneurs, mostly in the agribusiness sector. So what was the missing gap was actually funding. And so I had access to a lot of these entrepreneurs that I had worked with from the past, visiting various regions. So the good thing about that was my initial pipeline and the future pipeline had actually been made accessible and ready based on the training and the capacity development we had done in the past. So we do not focus on only one region. We actually target almost all the regions as well. And then what we look at, we had particular sectors that we were interested in based on how many people could be employed and the future of that sector in the country as well. And the other one that I would say, there are many other criteria that we have, but the second one we looked at, most of the impact investors or other investors coming into the country were looking at businesses that were making, let's say, revenue of $1 million per annum. That is like the small or medium enterprises. The problem was our currencies were depreciating so fast that you could not judge. The assets of businesses changed rapidly. So then there has to be a new model based on the number of people who were employed by the businesses, was what was one of the criteria we used. Hope it helped.
And the question on partnerships, how do you go about finding partners? Who wants to give a response on that?
Okay, so partnerships, just to not to repeat myself and all of us too much, but in creating partnerships, for me it was an organic part of this entire process. It was the foundational aspect of why we should do this. It was because we shared stories, and in sharing stories we realized there's a vulnerability there that you should embrace, and it helped us in building these partnerships. And we went into this with a leadership team of 3, and now we have a leadership team, a management team of 12, and it's all based on sharing stories, which leads to coming towards some kind of shared purpose. And at the bottom line is that we really do share that purpose. And I think that is, for me, the essence of building partnerships and why it's important, not just in your management team, but with the people you work with, the people you work for, and the people you eventually want to represent.
A few quick thoughts on partnerships. One, I just think at a fundamental level, really important that they're mutually beneficial. If you want to sort of collaborate with someone, they need to get something out of it as well. And you need to think of, because if it's mutually beneficial, it's going to sustain itself. If it's not, it's probably going to fail and probably going to end quite quickly. I think in terms of forming partnerships, two thoughts there. One, I do think relationships are really important on a personal level. And even if sort of a partnership makes sense on an intellectual or a business level, never underestimate the power of personal connections, never underestimate the power of a handwritten letter, never underestimate the power of an in-person meeting. And I think that often, if people like you, they'll go out of their way to support you. One other thing just about getting going. I think often people are intimidated about approaching people. And one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received, and it sounds really obvious, but if you don't ask, the answer's a guaranteed no. And so by asking, you can only increase your odds. You can't go backwards. You can't go below 0%. And I think having that attitude of, you know, I can only improve my odds, you know, by asking, that, at least for me, helped me to sort of approach people and ask people for things that I might not otherwise have been prepared to do. And so they're just a couple of thoughts. Did anyone want to add anything? Otherwise, we'll go to more questions. Sure. Okay. Who else has questions? At the back.
Yes, what do you think of Dan Pilato's TED Talk referring to how nonprofits are viewed as? Dan Pilato is the one who had a nonprofit that made over $500 million for AIDS Foundation and also for breast cancer research. Yet his organization was taken down because 40% of the overhead, well, 40% of the overhead was for running the business. What's your thoughts on that?
Can I actually give her, this is one of the issues I get worked up about, and I also gave a talk on this. I think that, you know, when we're deciding whether to invest in Facebook or Google or Apple, you don't care about how much they spend on admin, and no one even knows how much they spend on admin. What you care about is the return, in that case, the financial return. And we recognize in the for-profit arena that there isn't much of a difference between, you know, the inputs, the admin costs, and actually the financial return. We recognize that what is far more important is how you approach problems. And I think that the same is true in the social sector, that the huge difference between one social venture and another social venture is in how they approach it. And some social ventures are going to be hundreds, thousands of times more effective than others. You can compare Wikipedia, which has a staff of, say, 20 people, to other social ventures also focused on education, which might have 20 staff members and not have anywhere near the same reach as something like Wikipedia. Maybe not the greatest example, but you see that different ventures trying to do the same thing have dramatically different results. And so if we accept that different ventures have hugely different social outcomes, then that is a far bigger difference than the difference of 10% or 20% or 5% in admin costs. And I think 5, 10, 20% really doesn't make much of a difference. And I obviously think it's arguable that actually spending that money leads to a greater social impact if it's used well. And so that's just one thought. I personally think that admin costs should never be raised, should never be a measure. I think that from a marketing perspective, the reality is that donors do care about it. I don't think they should care about it, but they do. And so I do think that in an ideal world, we wouldn't care. The reality is people do, therefore maybe you should take it into account. Some organizations like the Anti-Malaria Foundation, which provides beds nets, they approach it, they sort of segment their accounts so they have some donors pay their 25% admin costs, and so then they can say that everyone else is giving 100%. That's more for marketing reasons. In practice, it doesn't make a difference, but different charities and social enterprises are approaching it in different ways. The other thing that I'd say on this is I think it's interesting and strange that, you know, you walk into a cafe, and if there's a sign on the wall that says, we donate 20% of our profits to charity, what do you think of that cafe? You probably think it's a good cafe, good people, doing a lot of good work. And so we're fine with a cafe that spends, you know, 80% of their profits and keeps 80% of the money to themselves and donates 20% to charity, and we think that they're good. But in the social arena, if, you know, you take 20% of the money for yourself and you sort of make a bit of profit on the side, but most of your focus, 80% of your focus is social, we think, you know, they're greedy, it's wrong, they're bad people. And so I think it's interesting that, you know, if we're 80% socially focused, that's bad. If we're 80% profit focused, that's fine. Because we compare to either extreme. We compare sort of the cafe to other cafes that keep 100%. We compare sort of a social enterprise that keeps 20% to those that keep nothing, rather than comparing those two ventures to each other. And so I think that, you know, we're fine with almost honest greed, but we're not fine with imperfect generosity. And I think that that's sort of an interesting, you know, fact about the world that social entrepreneurs should be aware of, and why some social entrepreneurs who do want to make money actually find it better and easier to be for-profit and then have the or to brand as for-profit with a bit of social, even if social is their main motivation, rather than brand as socially focused with a bit of financial. So there, sorry, rant over. Did anyone else want to add to that?
I might say something about partnerships because I'm being
Sure.
such an advocate for them. If you guys didn't notice, it's something I'm passionate about. The thing I was just going to say as I was thinking about what other folks were saying is that, like, there's a couple of levels of partnership. Like if you're LLC or B Corp or 501c3 nonprofit, your board is really important. And you need different types of board members. You need active, roll your sleeves up, get dirty board members, and you need board members that supply resources or wisdom, and you need board members that provide clout. So like for me, eventually I'm gonna have to call upon celebrities to really begin to vocalize and support what we're doing. And that's just inevitable when you're in the media world. Even if the media that our youth create is not anything better than Michael Moore holding the camera at his feet, but it doesn't matter. Like, we have to have something that says, like, we have value there. And then there's the partnerships like Youth Build that I talked about, where we're supplying a service to one another that you were saying was like mutually beneficial, and that's really critical as well. So they're filling the gap of bringing youth out of marginalization. I'm filling the gap of giving youth a chance to think about, now that I'm not under the oppressive circumstances of homelessness or lack of subpar education or, domestic violence, whatever it is, what do I do with all this free time? Like, how do I make myself something? And that's what I am sort of targeting. And then there's the partnerships where you think that this person will never be an ally, and those are your competitors or people who seem to rub up against you the wrong way. Those are the most important people to partner with, to understand their perspectives. And if you're the problem or they're the problem, it means that you're the solution and they're the solution. So really thinking about that and grinding into why it is that there's some reason you guys can't connect is an important thing to be mindful about. So I think that's where a lot of learning and growth has come for me. Questions?
At the back.
Hi. So one thing I noticed about being an entrepreneur is that you have a great idea, but when you try to go out and find partners, volunteers, stakeholders, you don't have a lot of track record for what you're doing. So I'm just curious, how do you guys present yourself and able to convince your first partner that you can do this, this is going to be great, and how much is like your education, maybe some of your success story, how do you appeal to them that there's something in this story that will benefit them, and also you're the person who can deliver it. How do you convince them? I think that's like the big struggle for a lot of entrepreneurs.
Very good question. Yep.
Hi, I wanted to ask Michelle, because what you're doing has to do with an issue that can be socially conflicting within your country. Empowering women can be socially conflicting for determined sectors within Pakistan. So have you had any experience in getting support from companies, from the private sector or from other arenas, when the issue that you're working is not as popular as puppies or babies?
Well, you mentioned always looking at the marginal impact of your career. What will happen if you are not doing this job? Will there be other qualified people who are also doing this? So I'm just wondering, like, what are the top higher marginal impact career out there? Obviously, there's the social enterprise, but what are the other options?
Sure. Maybe one more question.
I just want to add on to that question that, you know, there's this thing about going out and convincing others, and there's also that the dilemma that I face for myself is, when do I start? I mean, when do I take the initiative? I mean, how do I put up that courage that now is the time that I can start, you know, strolling out the idea that I've been thinking about, and I can actually, you know, where does the self-courage come from?
Sure, fantastic. We might begin with the track record question. So, how do you sort of, at the beginning, when you don't have many runs on the board, you don't have much traction, how do you convince people? How do you bring people along with you? How do you form those partnerships? Who wants to give a thought on that?
So our first and still our biggest partner is the hospital that we test at. And one of the big ways to convince them, you know, this was especially difficult for me at the time because when I presented to the CEO, I was around 14. So, yeah.
He's still at high school. It's very impressive everything he's doing.
Oh, thank you. But, you know, I just tried to show the need for my product. That was the biggest thing, and demonstrate the prototype in a way that made sense to people not necessarily familiar with what we were doing. We also used the track record of previous companies to test it at the hospital. There were great systems that were actually tested at the hospital I test at now, that are now being used across the hospital chain and are saving the cost of, you know, the hospital money and actually helping people. So.
A strategy that we applied a lot at Open Biome, I think, was just sort of potentially over marketing a little bit our track record and you know the sort of vague connections you have with leaders in the field, and you know you kind of talk to one guy and then go talk to someone else and say, yeah, this guy is very interested in working with us, but we want to work with you first. And so, you know, a little bit of kind of bluster, I think, can go a long way in terms of kind of giving yourself the confidence that you need to, you know, really sell what you have, and as long as you believe in kind of what you're offering, and you know, once you can start to get those first couple reps, yeah, it gets a lot easier to kind of get more partners or more you know, work going on. But I think those first couple, it's really sort of a bit of yeah, potentially over marketing sort of the position that you're actually in.
Just to add to the track record question, you know, when we started, we had no track record. There's no football in the country. What there was terrible. So, I mean, and this speaks to Sylvia's question also. Just do it. Do it and add up every time it'll win. And when you know, and then overmarket it maybe later. but just do it. And when people see, especially the people you're trying to convince, when they see that passion, when you're able to convey that, which you probably will be if most of you choose to do, you know, something that you're passionate about. That in itself is credibility, because that, I mean, it all comes back to that you know, that relationship building. People feed off of that. If they believe in you, they will believe in your project, and they might believe in themselves being part of that project also.
I think one thing on track record is you've got to see things from the partner's perspective, and you've got to sort of put yourself in their shoes. And I think from their perspective, they don't want any partnership to reflect badly on them if it fails. And so ideally you want to structure a partnership that reduces their risk, whether it's, you know, doing a pilot project or having an exit option for them, or, you know, think of how, from their perspective, even if it fails, they're still in an okay position. And the more that you can reduce their risk, the more willing they'll be to support you. I think also, you know, sometimes you do need to have a bit of traction. So develop the minimum viable product, get some runs on the board, and then have partnerships. But also you want to obviously appear confident and credible, as though it's going to happen. Obviously it's better if you don't have to fake it till you make it, but I do think that if you're confident and if you believe in yourself, and if you can show that in some way, so say you have one proof of where it worked, or say you have one really high profile client. I mean, when I was starting out the consultancy, we did a project for Red Cross, and it was hugely successful, and we did really good work and got really good reviews and testimonials from them. That then made it easier to go to other clients and partners and say, you know, and their approach was, well, if Red Cross was happy with it, I guess we'll do it too. And so once you get some traction or do some things, you can use that as proof of concept to then get other partners on board. those are a few thoughts. In terms of the marginal impact of jobs, I think one sort of thing that I'd add there is I think you do have the greatest impact where you have flexibility and you're able to make decisions. I think jobs where you're able to make decisions are those where you can have a greater impact as compared with jobs where you're just sort of doing what you're told or doing something that is very routine and repetitive. So, you know, being an accountant, not that if anyone's an accountant here, not that I'm criticizing you, but you'd hope at least that most accountants would do roughly the same thing and not be too creative in their accounting. Maybe there is some scope there, but I think the jobs where you make decisions and where the outcome is more dependent on you are the ones where you have the highest potential to have an impact. You also have the highest potential to have downside as well. And so you do want to do a job both where there's flexibility in terms of decision making, but also a job that you do think that you're reasonably good at. It might be that you are better at it, or it might just be that you're more committed to it and more energetic and more enthusiastic and going to dedicate more time to it. But whatever sort of that you think you can both make decisions and make better decisions for whatever reason. I know that's not specific to a career, but it could be entrepreneurship or politics or something else, or being a lecturer or whatever it is. But those are some things to think about. Then there was the question of how do you deal in the environment that you're working in?
It's an important question for people who work in, I guess, challenging environments, and it's an important one because, how do I phrase this? So, in dealing with mindsets and cultural, systemic and often institutional problems, the approach that's worked best is to kind of convince across generations. And I think that that's been one of our biggest assets, that we've been able to talk to parents, community leaders, children, and in doing that, we kind of develop their thinking, and that permeates within their little, within their own, I guess, ecosystems. And again, it boils down to convincing people of there's a shared value there. There is a benefit. Yes, females it's hard to work with females in a lot of these areas, but none of their mothers want them to grow up the way they did. So if you can tap into that, that's a huge resource to be able to do what you want to do.
I think we're basically out of time, so apologies for those people who still have questions. Just as sort of the final thing, we might just go down the line and I might just ask you, we've given a fair bit of advice and thoughts and so on. I want to ask, what is the best piece of advice someone has given you? I think I'll go first. I've already said a few, but I think one thing that I was told is assume the universe will conspire in your favor. And I think that you want to be dissatisfied with the status quo, but optimistic about the future. And it's those people who can live in that state of almost positive dissatisfaction that I think are the ones that succeed and the ones that make the biggest difference. And I do think you're not going to have everything figured out from the beginning, but you need to head broadly in the right direction and have faith that you'll figure it out along the way.
Best piece of advice is from that movie, Constant Vigilance, something like that. But I think it's just been that you just have to be mindful of what you're doing and how you're doing it, and things will fall into place. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but as was mentioned earlier, eventually.
I think one very valuable piece of advice that I received was to make no enemies. I think kind of echoing the partnerships theme that's been here, you can feel tempted, I think, to go into battle against, maybe it's a competitor, maybe it's a organization that's somehow involved in your space that maybe isn't so excited about a new upstart. But particularly if you're just starting out as a kind of new entrepreneur, whoever it is that you might feel like you want to go against is probably better resourced and knows a lot better what they're doing than you do. And so to the extent that you can find those people where you have that conflict and really engage with those individuals and figure out how you can sort of build a partnership as opposed to a competitive relationship, I think you'll be much better served.
I think, the best piece of advice I've ever received was to do what you love. And I think as entrepreneurs, we're really in a special place, we come, I'm not in this position, but I know you can come out of business school and basically do whatever you want. And I think choosing entrepreneurship is such a special track. A recent study came out of Wharton like a month or so ago, and they tracked the happiness of all the Wharton graduates, and the ones who went into entrepreneurship were by far the happiest. So I just think that's interesting.
Great. I think the best one I had, I was actually transitioning. I was trying to figure out if I should go to business school or keep doing what I was doing, which was my microfinance institution, the first business that I started. And my first investor said to me, he said, you know what, Procy, business school will always be there. So if you fail, you go to business school. If you succeed, you can go to business school. So just do the work.
Oh my gosh, I love all of that. I mean, I would say the best advice that I get pretty much on a daily basis is you're always going to have fear, and you're always going to have doubt, particularly if you're on a frontier. And so just walk through it. Like, think about, okay, if I have the ability to think about the fear and the wreckage of my future, I have the ability to think about the solution of my future. And so just seek to, is what I've been told, seek to shift your thinking so that you don't implode on yourself when you're going through these really challenging spaces where you're doing something new or you might be getting tough feedback. And the other last piece is, humility is different than humiliation, and I've definitely experienced both in this process. But the humility is my willingness to learn, and that's like a true form of dignity that I give myself. It's okay not to know all the answers. And so to put the pressure down of being a perfectionist is so critical in this area. Hope that helps.
Well, I think we're out of time, but hopefully you enjoyed that discussion. Hopefully you took away one or two things that are useful, and enjoy the rest of the conference.